10 old Hollywood stars, 10 legends, all brought down by the same silent killer. Not scandal, not sabotage, but smoke. In the golden age of cinema, long before warning labels and public bans, smoking wasn't just accepted, it was iconic. A cigarette wasn't a health hazard, it was a signature. From brooding detectives to glamorous divas, lighting up was part of the performance. Studios encouraged it, advertisers paid for it, audiences imitated it, but behind the velvet curtains and glowing marquees, the truth was already burning. These were the faces of Hollywood. Beautiful, magnetic, immortal on screen. And yet every puff pulled them closer to an ending no script had written. Lung cancer, heart failure, emphysema, it didn't matter how big the name was, the smoke didn't care. In this video, we're diving into the lives and deaths of 10 old Hollywood icons whose careers were legendary and whose final act was shaped by the very habit that made them look untouchable. And by the end, you'll learn which star's death shook the industry so deeply it forced Hollywood to finally reconsider the cost of glamorizing a killer. Gary Cooper, the quiet hero who couldn't outstare the inevitable. Gary Cooper never needed to raise his voice. He could stand still in a frame and say everything with a glance, a masterclass in restraint. In High Noon, Sergeant York, and Mr. Deeds, he carried entire films not with noise, but with presence. He was the man you trusted. The man who did the right thing, even when it cost him everything. On screen, he was calm under pressure. Off screen, he held to the same stillness, but not without cost. Cooper smoked almost constantly. It was never a trademark, never stylized or showy, just a quiet part of his life. A cigarette in hand during interviews, between takes, in solitude. His image was clean, composed. But his lungs, his blood, his organs told a different story. For decades, the damage built up quietly, just like everything else about him. In the late 1950s, Cooper was diagnosed with prostate cancer. It metastasized, silently, relentlessly, spreading to his bones, liver, and lungs. True to form, he told almost no one. Not the public, not most of his friends. Even in decline, he wanted to remain Gary Cooper, stoic, strong, unshaken. When he did go public, it was only weeks before his death in 1961. He passed away at 60, dignified and private to the last breath. The man who once walked into a gunfight alone at noon didn't flinch when the Real fight came. But even heroes, especially the quiet ones, aren't made of stone. And some battles start with a flick of a match. Humphrey Bogart, the man who made smoke look cool until it didn't. He was the face of American masculinity, sharp-tongued, cold-eyed, and always with a cigarette hanging off his lip like punctuation to a perfect line. Humphrey Bogart didn't just play tough guys, he defined them. In Casablanca, the Maltese Falcon, the Big Sleep, the smoke was always there, curling around him like a second character in the scene. But what audiences never saw was how real that smoke became when the cameras cut. Bogart wasn't acting, he was a smoker, through and through. Off-screen, it wasn't for image. It was habit, routine, comfort, and eventually, consequence. By the time he was diagnosed with esophageal cancer in the mid-1950s, the damage had already written its own ending. His voice, once gravelly and iconic, weakened. His weight dropped. And the man who never blinked in the face of danger suddenly faced something no script could solve. He tried to keep his illness quiet, playing it off with the same sly detachment that made him famous. But behind the scenes, the pain grew. Chemotherapy and surgery came too late. In 1957, Humphrey Bogart, the legend, the icon, the eternal tough guy, faded out at just 57 years old. His death wasn't just a personal loss, it was a quiet alarm. One of Hollywood's brightest stars had dimmed not in scandal, but in silence, taken by the very image he helped sell. And the smoke that once made him immortal on screen? It had already written his final line. Bette Davis, the woman who spit fire and breathed smoke. Bette Davis didn't play by the rules, she rewrote them. Sharp, commanding, and utterly uncompromising, she was never just a leading lady. She was the storm that rewrote the script, turned roles into revolutions, and carved out space in a man's world by sheer force of will. But for all her defiance, there was one thing she never fought: the cigarette. It wasn't just part of her image, it was part of her punctuation. A dramatic pause, a defiant glare, a slow exhale that could say more than a page of dialogue. In films like All About Eve and now Voyager, smoking wasn't an accessory, it was her weapon. Off-screen, it was her companion. She reportedly smoked over 100 cigarettes a day, as much a fixture in her life as a camera or a contract. But that lifelong ritual carved a path she couldn't outact. In her later years, Davis battled multiple illnesses, including a stroke, a mastectomy, and ultimately cancer. Though officially diagnosed with breast cancer, the decades of relentless smoking left her body fighting on every front: lungs, heart, circulation, recovery. Everything slowed. Everything hurt. Still, she kept moving, appearing at award shows, giving interviews, writing memoirs. Her fire never faded, but the cost of feeding it had long since added up. In 1989, at 81, she was gone. No dramatic final performance, no farewell tour. Just the end of a woman who lived on her own terms and smoked on them, too. Clark Gable, the king who couldn't outrun the clock. Clark Gable didn't walk onto a movie set. He arrived, like thunder in human form. His presence didn't ask for attention, it commanded it. With that crooked smile, steel gaze, and voice like weathered leather, Gable wasn't just the leading man. He was the standard by which all others were measured. He was Rhett Butler, Fletcher Christian, and a dozen other roles carved from the myth of the perfect American male. And always, almost always, he had a cigarette in hand. Gable smoked like it was second nature. On set, off set, between takes, in interviews. It wasn't style. It wasn't rebellion. It was routine, as regular as breathing. And somewhere along the way, the body that carried all that charm and swagger started carrying something else, a growing strain on the heart that powered all. By 1960, Gable was 59 and filming The Misfits under the desert sun alongside Marilyn Monroe and Montgomery Clift, both battling their own demons. The shoot was grueling. He insisted on doing his own stunts, pushing his body harder than it could take. Just days after filming wrapped, he suffered a massive heart attack. 10 days later, he was gone. The world mourned the king of Hollywood, but few talked about the years of heavy smoking, the relentless physical demands, or the silent buildup of damage behind that invincible image. Clark Gable didn't fade. He charged ahead until the body said enough. And by then, the cameras had already stopped rolling. John Wayne, the giant who couldn't dodge what was coming. John Wayne was more than a movie star. He was America on horseback. Towering, invincible, and never without a righteous cause, he didn't just play heroes, he became one. For millions, he was the voice of strength, a walking monument of certainty in an uncertain world. But beneath the swagger and steel-eyed calm, there was something else following him, something no six-shooter or cavalry charge could stop. Wayne smoked constantly, not for image, not for effect, simply because it was what he did, pack after pack, year after year. On screen, it fit the tough, stoic persona. Off-screen, it followed him from trailer to set to home, unnoticed until the toll became impossible to ignore. In 1964, he was diagnosed with lung cancer. One lung was removed, but Wayne didn't retreat. He gave interviews. He worked. He called himself a survivor. He wanted the public to see the fight, not the fear. And for a while, it seemed like he'd outrun it. But the damage wasn't done with him. In the late 1970s, a new cancer appeared, this time in the stomach. After surgery and a slow, painful decline, the Duke died in 1979 at the age of 72. He left behind over 170 films and a myth that still lingers in American culture. But behind that myth was a man who spent decades breathing in the one thing even he couldn't stare down. And in the end, it didn't come with a bang. It came with a whisper he never saw coming. Edward G. Robinson, the voice of the gangster, silenced slowly. He wasn't tall. He wasn't classically handsome. But Edward G. Robinson didn't need height or beauty to dominate screen. All he needed was that face, sharp calculating, and that voice. Nasal, clipped, full of menace. He could fill a room without raising his tone, playing gangsters and tycoons with a quiet fury that felt far more dangerous than shouting ever could. Robinson was a machine, over 100 films, nearly 5 decades of performances, never fading, never flinching. But behind that steady march of roles was a man slowly hollowed out by habit. Like so many of his era, Robinson smoked heavily, not just in character but in life. It was part of the rhythm of being on set, part of the image the public expected. He lit up between takes, during interviews, at home. No grand declarations, no visible concern, just a lifelong pattern carved into routine. By the early 1970s, the years had caught up with him. He was diagnosed with bladder cancer, a disease with strong links to long-term tobacco use. He kept the diagnosis quiet, even as his health declined. He continued working almost to the very end, with his final role completed just 2 weeks before his death in 1973. Edward G. Robinson didn't go out with a final monologue or curtain call. The man who gave voice to Hollywood's most unforgettable criminals was silenced by something slow, quiet, and far too common. Not a bullet, not a betrayal, just the steady erosion of years lived in smoke. Spencer Tracy, the actor who made it look easy until it wasn't. Spencer Tracy didn't act, he became. In a time when performance was often about presence, flair, and voice, Tracy stood apart. Understated, controlled, effortless. He had a way of listening on screen that made him seem more alive than anyone else in the frame. Directors trusted him. Audiences believed him. Fellow actors admired him with a quiet awe. But what Tracy hid from the public was how hard it was to be Spencer Tracy. Off-screen, he was a man full of contradictions, deeply private, emotionally restless, and dependent on the rituals that kept the storm at bay. One of those rituals was smoking. Not for drama, not for image, just a constant, quiet presence. Between scenes, between words, between years, he smoked heavily for most of his life, even as his health began to unravel. By the 1960s, the effects were no longer avoidable. His heart was struggling. His breathing was shallow. He was aging faster than he should have, but he refused to stop working. Even in his final film, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, the wear is visible, the actor still sharp, but the body already dimming. Tracy died of a heart attack in 1967, just 17 days after filming Wrapped. He was 67. There was no scandal, no spectacle, just silence. He left behind a body of work unmatched in its depth, and a life shaped by quiet habits that wore him down as steadily as his roles built him up. The most believable actor of his generation, even when the performance was just survival. Nat King Cole, the velvet voice drenched in smoke. His voice didn't just sing, it floated. Smooth, effortless, and unmistakably his. Nat King Cole was elegance personified, turning even the simplest melody into something eternal. He made pain sound beautiful. He made love feel timeless. On stage, he was grace. On screen, he was charm. In public, he was poise. And in private, he was always smoking. Cigarettes were part of his silhouette. That suit, that tie, that cigarette in hand, glowing faintly as he leaned into the microphone. It looked refined, deliberate, a final touch of style. But it was more than image. Nat King Cole smoked constantly, up to 3 packs a day. He claimed it kept his voice low, rich, warm. And maybe it did for a time. But every note came with a cost. In 1964, doctors discovered a tumor in his left lung. He was just 45 years old. Still touring, still recording, still sounding like no one else alive. But his body was already breaking. Surgery removed the tumor, but the cancer had spread. Radiation, hospital stays, public reassurances. None of it worked. Just months later, Cole was gone, a legend silenced before his story could even hit its second act. He left behind a sound that still plays in restaurants, radios, and holiday memories. But behind that voice, so gentle, so permanent, was a habit louder than any lyric. One that shaped his tone, then stole it. The smoke gave him a signature, and then took the silence for itself. Joan Crawford, steel on the outside, ashes beneath. Joan Crawford didn't climb to the top. She scraped her way up with bloodied nails and a smile that dared you to underestimate her. In the world of old Hollywood, where beauty aged fast and power rarely came in heels, she built an empire out of determination and control. Every shot, every dress, every movement, meticulously chosen. Nothing was left to chance, except perhaps the smoke. Crawford was always seen with a cigarette, not for softness, not for relaxation, for command. It was part of her armor, the way she held it, the way she used it to pace a scene, the way it carved a line between her and everyone else in the room. Off-screen, it never left her hand. Decades of smoking, sometimes more than a pack a day, followed her through every reinvention. Silent starlet, Oscar-winning powerhouse, TV guest, and finally recluse. By the time her final films came, her health was already deteriorating. She developed pancreatic cancer, a disease difficult to trace with certainty, but one known to be heavily influenced by years of smoking. Her public appearances stopped. The makeup faded. The sharp edges dulled. The woman who once controlled every frame slowly slipped out of view, one breath at a time. In 1977, Joan Crawford died quietly in her New York apartment. No close-ups, no final scene, just silence. A woman who mastered the art of image, undone not by scandal or failure, but by the one habit she never tried to direct. Jean Harlow, the platinum flame that burned too fast. Jean Harlow wasn't just a star, she was a phenomenon. The original blonde bombshell, with hair so pale it looked like moonlight and a laugh that could flip a scene on its head. At just 21, she became the face of a new kind of woman, sharp, sexy, and unapologetically modern. Studios marketed her as untouchable, indestructible, eternal, but the truth was far more fragile. Behind the soft focus lenses and shimmering gowns, Harlow was already breaking down. She smoked like most of her era did, early, often, and without hesitation. It added edge to the glamour, a modern sensibility that made her seem older, more in control. But she wasn't. By her mid-20s, the toll was already visible. Constant illness, chronic fatigue, an immune system weakened by the very image she was built to uphold. In 1937, while filming Saratoga, Harlow collapsed on set. She was 26. What began as nausea turned into organ failure. Diagnosed with uremic poisoning, the end came fast, kidneys overwhelmed, body shutting down. And while smoking wasn't the cause in a textbook sense, it was one of the countless stressors on a body pushed to the edge too early. A system compromised, and a life stolen in silence. She was gone before Hollywood could decide what to do with her. No farewell tour. No final act. Just a void. Jean Harlow lit up screens, rooms, and imaginations, but like all flames burning too brightly, she left only smoke in her place. They were icons. Untouchable. Eternal. Faces we still recognize, voices we still hear, performances that still stir something inside us. But behind the glamour of old Hollywood, behind the elegance, the control, the polish, there was a habit nearly all of them shared. One that was sold as sophistication and carried a quiet cost they could never outrun. Smoking wasn't seen as dangerous back then. In many cases, it was part of the job, encouraged by studios, glamorized in scripts, even endorsed in advertisements by the very stars it would eventually claim. These legends didn't know they were breathing in something that would steal years from their lives. And by the time the truth began to surface, for many, it was already too late. This isn't about judgment. It's about understanding the full picture, the talent, the pressure, the image, and the humanity. These were brilliant artists, complex people, and their stories deserve to be told in full, not just as legends, but as lives. If this video gave you a new perspective or reminded you of someone you admire, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your memories or reflections in the comments below. And if you want to see more deep dives like this, stories that honor the stars while uncovering the shadows behind the spotlight, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss what's next. Because every legend has a story, and some of them are still waiting to be told.